Welcome to week 3. This week we will venture into one of the more interesting and challenging areas of impact, land use and socioeconomics. This is a huge area to cover even in the most straightforward analysis because there are so many different types of impacts and a large constituency to consider. And this area of impact really hits people where it counts, in their livelihoods, their homes, and their community structure. Intangible impacts are tough to account for, although there are ever more sophisticated methods of accounting for effects. Direct and indirect effects on community life, especially during project implementation, are many. The influx of workers and the impacts of new residents associated with the project have to be taken into account. Disruption of businesses during project implementation are important, as are impacts on less representative communities. Consideration of environmental justice issues must be part of the EA and EIS analysis. This area of analysis must take into consideration the secondary and cumulative effects of the project on future land use, particularly in transportation projects. This part of the EA challenges our analysis to be as comprehensive as possible and to consider a wide range of issues. Based upon the list of alternatives for your virtual project, including the no-action alternative, and the description of your project or project area, write a brief analysis of the effects and impacts your project will have on the current land use and development for each alternative. Include any secondary effects or cumulative impacts you think may result from your project activities. Secondly, write a brief analysis of any social and/or neighborhood effects for each alternative. Note that you should be sure to search examples of EAs and EISs on the web and to cite the correct website addresses. In order for me to know that you understand the course material, I expect to see some, but not necessarily all of these issues addressed within your virtual project, so be creative. Remember, you will use the EVSP 415 EA format located in the lessons section of your classroom as a template for your virtual EA. You will use this format only. To help you with your analysis, copy and complete the environmental screening form found in the classroom. Copy and paste the form into a Word document. Complete the ESA form and keep it for reference. You do not need to submit the ESF within the assignments section. Although the form was developed for use by the National Park Service, your virtual project may not be located in a national park, but it still applies. The most important sections of this form to complete are Section C, Resource Effects to Consider, and Section D, Mandatory Criteria, because the answers to these questions will determine any needs for additional data collection. Remember, you are filling out this ESF for your benefit and do not need to turn in the ESF for credit. I want to take a few minutes to talk about cumulative and secondary impacts. Throughout the development of your EA, you'll be asked to think about the 3 types of effects covered by NEPA. To the extent possible, your EAs should have addressed the more complicated but interesting cumulative and secondary or indirect effects, as well as the project's direct environmental impact. Here's a summary of the 3 types of impacts addressed in NEPA analysis. Direct effects. These are impacts that are caused by the alternatives at the same time and in the same place as the action. For example, grading a building site removes soil and vegetation at the site, and if an archaeological resource is present, destroys surface and subsurface deposits. Indirect effects. Indirect effects are impacts caused by the alternatives that occur later in time or further in distance from the action. For instance, if allowing a utility to string a transmission line through a park to serve a nearby town is something you reasonably expect will ultimately result in increased growth and encroachment of development on park boundaries, these indirect impacts need to be included in the NEPA document analyzing the transmission line. Implementing a day-use reservation system in a national park may have indirect socioeconomic impacts on neighboring businesses or concessions inside the park. These are examples of impacts occurring later in time. The alternatives may also have indirect effects that occur further in distance from the action. For instance, discharging effluent into a river would affect the water quality far from the actual site of the release. You do not need to spell out direct or indirect effects specifically in a NEPA document, although cumulative impacts do need to be identified separately. What are cumulative impacts? Cumulative effects are additive impacts to a particular resource. An EIS or an EA analyzes them without regard to land ownership. For example, cumulative effects may occur from actions on private or other public land, and it includes impacts of actions in the past, the present, and the reasonable foreseeable future. Although it is clear that CEQ does not want agencies to segment their proposals into pieces that have less potential for significant impact alone than when they are viewed together, the requirement to analyze cumulative impacts goes much further than this. A complete picture of forces already acting upon a particular environmental resource is essential in making reasonable decisions about the management of that resource. If sources of impact exist, whether they are on private or public land, or whether they were taken in the past or are ongoing now, or have a reasonable chance of occurring in a future when the impacts of the proposal are also ongoing, their combined impacts give decision makers and the public a clear idea of the absolute impact the resource is experiencing. For instance, if your city or park is proposing clearing vegetation to build a campground in the middle of important elk winter range, last year's timber cut on the adjacent federal forest and elk winter range has an additive impact on the elk population, must be part of the cumulative impact. A large housing development proposed for next year on private land in elk habitat is also going to have an adverse effect, and this should be included if you believe it is reasonable to assume the homes will be built. For this example, cumulative impacts can extend over entire watersheds or thousands of square miles of elk range, yet because the action causing an impact is further away from the park's proposal in time or geographically, it often has a diminishing additive impact. The interdisciplinary team, or IDT, is critical in deciding which actions, activities, or sources of impact to include in a cumulative impact analysis, and the team should include common sense in deciding the extent of the cumulative impact's boundary. Although a multitude of actions may contribute impact infinitesimally to the same resource that the proposal is expected to affect, only those that resource specialists fear are clear contributors or can feasibly be analyzed need to be included. As a general rule, the further removed an action from the project area or the project start date, the less need there is for detailed and exact analysis of the action's cumulative impacts. Land use scenarios fall into this analysis. For example, if your park isn't built, will the land be rezoned for industrial development? In some cases, this will be a reasonable assumption if discussions of zoning have been ongoing and proposals submitted. The analysis of cumulative impacts may be particularly important for larger scale planning or research management efforts. To return to the elk example, if elk winter range is a resource that you believe is important to maintain in pristine condition within the area, but a migration corridor between it and elk summer range is proposed for development, knowing how the developed corridor will affect the elk population may be important in deciding how to manage the region's winter range.